Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to start in about 2 minutes. We need cart captioning, I'm sticking the link for the captions, and you should be able to see them on YouTube and whatever other platform you are viewing this broadcast from. So, again, we will start in just about a minute. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So, good evening, everyone, again, and thank you for joining Muslim Counter Publics Lab and Crushing Colonialism for our event tonight, Legacies of Genocide, ICWA and Haaland v. Brackeen. My name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I'm the Executive Director of Muslim Counter Publics Lab, an organization whose mission it is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that justify state violence against Muslims. Before I start my remarks, I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Peoria, Sauk, Fox, Miamia, Oceti, Sakowin, Ho Chunk, and Kickapoo lands. I honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have cared for it through generations. We know that land acknowledgments on their own are empty gestures when accompanied without action, and we are committed to building relationships and solidarity with our Indigenous, including Indigenous Muslim siblings. Last week, on November 9th, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case of Haaland v. Brackeen, a case that challenges the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed in 1978 to address the separation of Native children from their families, their parents, extended families, and communities by state child welfare and private adoption agencies. The case, which our brilliant speaker Jen Deerinwater, who I will introduce momentarily, will speak about, is foundational to understanding the deep roots of white Christian supremacy in the state violence of the settler colonial country we currently call the United States. As a Muslim organization that is fighting to challenge Islamophobic violence against our communities in the ongoing war on terror, we understand that what we are facing is part of the legacy of this country's violent colonial beginnings, which continue to this day. We know that the laws and policies we have and continue to push back on are not new, but have been in place for centuries since the first settler colonialists arrived to the shores of the country we now call the United States. In order to dismantle policies such as the anti Muslim and anti Black family separation of the Muslim and African bands, it is imperative to understand the legal underpinnings that have long been a foundation of this anti Black and settler colonial country, where the kidnapping of Native children and forced assimilation of Native children into boarding schools, attacks on tribal sovereignty, and theft of Native languages, cultures, religion, and lands has been repeatedly practiced by the state. While we know the violence of this country is enduring and endemic, we also know that for marginalized communities, our struggles are interconnected. We know that justice is incomplete if it doesn't include justice for Indigenous peoples. And finally, we know that the pursuit of justice for all our communities has ripple effects that even the strongest states cannot stop when we fight together. This month is Native American Heritage Month, and in order to put our words into actions, we are asking all of you who are tuning in to make a donation to Crushing Colonialism, which is an international Indigenous multimedia collective that tells the stories of Indigenous people to create a world that values and honors indigeneity. Tonight, with your help, we are hoping to raise at least $1,000 for Crushing Colonialism, and we hope you will join us in reaching this goal. We also have a ticker on the bottom of the screen that has a bit.ly link for where you can go to donate. And again, we would really appreciate your help in reaching our 1,000 goal for tonight. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker and friend, Jen Deerinwater, I wanted to share a few notes about accessibility. There is a link for cart captions that are live. We will post across all platforms. And what you need to do is to open a screen with that link and either place it on the side of or underneath the screen you're using to watch this broadcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. Additionally, once our speaker has presented, we will take questions from the audience. So please put any of your questions on whichever platform you are using to watch this broadcast. Finally, we will put all our social media links in the description so you can share the handles of Muslim Counter Publics Lab and Crushing Colonialism. So without further ado, I want to introduce our esteemed speaker, Jen Deerinwater. Jen Deerinwater is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her communities face with an interest in Indigenous communities. Jen is the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive, Communications Management from Simmons College. Of Massachusetts, Boston, and an MS in Communications Management from Simmons College. Jen is a contributor to Truthout, and her work has been featured in a wide range of publications, including Bitch, Rewire News, and New Now Next. Jen's writing is included in the anthologies Disability Visibility, First Person Stories from the 21st Century, We Organize to Change Everything, Fighting for Abortion Access and Reproductive Justice, Property Will Cost Us the Earth, Direct Action and the Future of the Global Climate Movement, and the forthcoming CRIP authorship, Disability as Method, from the NYU Press. She's the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive and is currently hard at work on her own book. Jen has been interviewed for numerous outlets on her work, and The Advocate named Jen a 2019 Champion of Pride. While a nomad at heart and raised in rural areas of her nation's reservation in Oklahoma and in rural Texas, Jen currently lives on occupied Piscataway land, known as Washington, D.C. So, Jen, I am going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And we are so excited to be hosting this event.
Hey, Ocio. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all. So, this case that we're talking about, Haaland v. Brackeen, it's pretty complex. It's actually ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, has been challenged legally more times than the Affordable Care Act. And so this particular case, Haaland v. Brackeen, is actually a mix of other ICWA challenged cases that have been brought before the Supreme Court. I want to say, if you want to really dig in deep and dive in deep into the story, particularly around the fostering and adoption of different Native children that are in these cases, I would recommend Rebecca Nagel's This Land podcast, season 2. It's phenomenal, and that gets really into the nitty gritty of like the children who are at the heart of this case. So I think what makes the most sense to start with here when talking about this is that the way that I am looking at this case, Haaland v. Brackeen, is that it's not just a U.S. government issue. This is an issue of colonialism, first of all. Anywhere colonizers have invaded, they take our children in one way or another. You know, in the so-called U.S., we have boarding schools. You know, the Department of Interior recently did a report on the boarding schools, and they found that between 1819 to 1969, these federally run boarding schools had consisted of 408 schools across 37 states or territories. And during this investigation that has only just started within the last year, they've already identified marked or unmarked burial sites at 53 different schools across the system. You know, so they're finding these graves of children at these boarding schools, which up north in so-called Canada, they have found thousands of unmarked graves of Native children at their residential school system. You know, the Church of Sweden has apologized to the Sami people for the role that they played in residential schools there. You know, very recently, there was an Indigenous child in the lands known as Australia who was murdered by someone simply for being Indigenous. You know, and we can think as well about, you know, Muslim children that are stolen through colonialism. I mean, Palestinian children are killed and snatched up by the Israeli government all the time. You know, so for me, this is not just one case, one issue. It's really, truly part of a larger problem of colonialism and what it does. You know, if you steal the children, then you steal a people's future. If there are no more children, then there is no more tribal nation. There is no more people. So that's really for me how I'm looking at this and the lens that I'm coming to all of this with. But now, in terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act, let me tell you all a little bit about what that is. So it was a widely supported, nonpartisan bill that passed in 1978. Still to this day, there are even conservatives and Republicans that support ICWA. So I want to make it clear this isn't a liberal versus conservative thing. Like, this was a nonpartisan bill that people on both sides of the aisles, you know, have supported. So under ICWA, child welfare placements, those cases involving Native children who are enrolled or eligible for enrollment in federally recognized tribes, those cases have to be heard in tribal courts when that is possible. And the child's tribe is permitted to be involved in the state court proceedings. The law also requires testimony from expert witnesses who are familiar with Native culture before a child can be removed from their homes. If a child is removed, ICWA requires that they be placed with extended family members. If they're not available, then other tribal members, and if not then other Native families from other tribes. And if all of that fails, then they can be placed in a non-Native home. You know, so prior to ICWA, studies found that 25 to 35% of all Native children were removed from their home by state child welfare and private adoption agencies. You know, and of those, 85% were placed in non-Native families, even when there were good homes and relatives available to them. And even now with ICWA in place, we still have issues of, child protective services taking our children from us. In Oklahoma, where my nation is and where I was born and spent most of my childhood, Cherokee Nation children make up 10% of the foster care system in Oklahoma. Native children, were still being removed at a rate of 2 to 3 times that of white children. And they often aren't placed with relatives or other Native families, despite ICWA being in place. And Native families are also the most likely to have their children removed from their homes as a first resort, and the least likely to be offered any sort of family supports, before they reach that point of taking a child. So ICWA, like I said, is nonpartisan. It is widely supported by Native and non-Native people. So 497 federally recognized tribes and 62 Native organizations, 23 states and Washington, D.C., 87 members of Congress, 27 child welfare and adoption organizations, and many others signed on to 21 briefs that were submitted to the court in favor of ICWA. The organization that I am a part of, Crushing Colonialism, we signed on to one of those amicus briefs. This is widely supported. So now, what is this case really about? If you're hearing that ICWA is supported by so many people, then why is this being challenged more times than the Affordable Care Act? Why? Doesn't make sense. Well, here's what it's really about. It's about destroying tribal sovereignty, and it's just using Native children as the fodder for it, basically. The Cato and Goldwater Institutes, which are, libertarian think tanks, they don't do anything around children's issues or child welfare. They have spoken out in legal documents in the past saying that, ICWA actually leads to more child abuse. The one of the attorneys that's arguing in this case, the Haaland v. Brackeen, his name is Chad Everett, and he is a lawyer at Gibson and Dunn. So Gibson and Dunn is this huge law firm who they represent 2 of the largest casino and gaming enterprises in the world. They also represent a lot of oil and gas. Chad Everett actually argued in support of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which, that is a whole story in and of itself. But just briefly, DAPL, as it was called, had been originally routed to go past a primarily white city, Bismarck. Yes, it was Bismarck, I believe. And the white people in the town got upset, so it was rerouted to go past several Native reservations. And so a large group of Native people and non-Native people came together during at the Standing Rock Reservation to fight the DAPL. So just so you know, like Gibson, Dunn, Cato, and Goldwater, these aren't people that have anything to do with children and child welfare, but they really want to see tribes gone, because if tribal nations continue to stand as political entities, then we have a right to consultation before pipelines or any projects go through our lands. We have a right to tribal gaming. 240 tribal governments have used Indian gaming to revive our communities. It's really just sort of a loophole in the law, from my understanding anyway, that even kind of gave us casinos, gave us the gaming. But that is a huge source of income that keeps our people going. It's also interesting that, for example, my tribe, Cherokee Nation, we've got all these casinos that they don't just better our communities. They provide jobs to non-Native people, who the vast majority of Oklahoma is white. It helps fund our healthcare system, which helps in turn take care of the larger communities, But Gibson and Dunn doesn't want us to have these things. And so what they did is they really cherry picked. Like Gibson and Dunn went to the Brackeen family. The Brackeens did not go to them. They went to the Brackeens. The Brackeens family, they're white, they're Christian, they're very sort of evangelical Christian. They've got money, they're professionals. They're sort of an ideal family where you're like, ooh, this is the perfect foster or adoption home. They also happen to be in the northern district of Texas, where that federal court district is just, it's overrun with right-wing nonsense. I mean, that's the court that the conservatives want to get everything through. So this case really has nothing to do, once again, with Native children. The Brackeen family, even the child that is named in this case, they ended up adopting the child. You know, ICWA did not stop them as a white family from being able to foster and adopt a Native child. And the other thing that's very frustrating is that going into the adoption, or excuse me, the foster of this child, they were told right out the gate, you know, this child is a tribal citizen, you will not be able to adopt them. So they knew from the start about this, but somehow just felt that they were entitled to take this child. You know, during some of the arguments that Gibson and Dunn made on behalf of the Brackeen family, as well as the state of Texas, which I'll get a little bit into them as well, you know, they really talked a lot about how ICWA treats children like property. And it's wild to me because the child welfare system and the private adoption system actually treats Native children like property. You know, the Brackeen family thinking they have a right to just come in and take a Native child, like just because they have money, like that is treating Native children like property. One other note on the Brackeens, they're actually trying to adopt one of the half siblings of the child in this case. And it's kind of coming out that in the process of trying to adopt this child, that they have pressured and coerced the parents and family members to sign away their rights to the child. You know, it's a very ugly system. And the attorney on this case, arguing for the family, you know, he actually said that, you know, quote, citizenship is a proxy for race. He said that tribes don't have the right to rule over natives everywhere, that Congress doesn't have the right to treat these children like property. He also made this strange argument about how Native children were forced to enroll in tribes while they were in boarding schools, you know, without their parents' approval, which it was just all very odd. Like, my citizenship as an American just happened automatically when I was born here. I didn't ask for it. So why is that somehow any different with my citizenship with Cherokee Nation? It was just some of their arguments, they just made no sense. You know, since the 1700s, Congress has had the ultimate authority to rule over Native people, you know, over Native tribes. The Supreme Court has ruled that way in many cases. You know, overturning ICWA is huge. And I can't recall which justice said it because I was in the court, I was in the press area. The case went on for 3 hours and 15 minutes. It was supposed to be an hour 40. It went on a very long time, and it was very difficult to sit through being in that court. But I digress a bit. You know, the argument that the Brackeen family's lawyer, Chad Everett from Gibson and Dunn, made about citizenship being a proxy for race, you know, there are people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds that are citizens of the United States or France or, you know, Colombia or whatever. That has nothing to do with race. You know, and the idea that in Texas also made this argument that tribes don't have the right to rule over natives everywhere. What they kept saying repeatedly is that they're fine with ICWA applying to children who are on reservations, but only then. But the thing about that, and I'll get into this a little bit more, is that a lot of tribes don't have land bases, and many of our people don't live on our lands. It's just another way of further eroding that tribal sovereignty. Now, the state of Texas, they I mean, these arguments are just absurd. I'm not a lawyer. So there's a lot there that I don't quite, I don't know case history and precedent and such. But some of these arguments that the Brackeen family and the state of Texas were making were just illogical. Texas actually tried to say that following ICWA put too much pressure and responsibility on them. But it was pointed out by one of the justices that Texas still has to follow other federally mandated family law, whether it has to do with natives or not. So how is this too much pressure for you? And Texas also tried to use this argument, the legal argument of anti-commandeering. It's really, from what I'm understanding, it's really just sort of coding for states' rights, which is, a very conservative dog whistle for getting rid of federal interventions in any way. But it's also, the interesting thing is that it's also a new legal ruling. Like, there's only recently been a case where anti-commandeering was used, and that was in the 90s, and it had nothing to do with Native people. Justice Coney Barrett, it's a little terrifying, but I think she might be the deciding vote or deciding rule in this case. But, she had questions for Texas about that made me think that she just wasn't like buying the argument of anti-commandeering. So that kind of gives me a little bit of hope on that. But in terms of this land-based argument and some of the larger issues that could come from this beyond just losing our children, which is devastating and horrific in and of itself. But I see this as also ushering in a new termination era. So in the 1950s and 60s, the US government did something that is referred to as the termination era. And they terminated the sovereign nation-to-nation relationship that many tribal nations and citizens of tribes have with the United States. And they did this through a number of ways. One of them was urban relocation. They wanted to get us off our reservations, out of our villages, rancherias, what have you. And so they told many of us, listen, if you move to cities, we'll give you housing, you'll have education, you'll have great jobs, made all these promises like they've always done. And then the Native people got to the cities and they were put in the poorest neighborhoods. They had the worst schools, but now they're not with their tribes. They're not on their lands. Now they're just on their own. A little over 70% of Native people live in urban and suburban areas. My tribe has a reservation, which right-wingers who don't want ICWA in place are also trying to overturn the Supreme Court case, McGirt, which actually reestablished my nation's reservation. But I don't live on my lands. I live in Washington, D.C., but that doesn't take away my citizenship. I'm still a Cherokee Nation citizen, just like if I went and moved to Australia, I'm still a U.S. citizen. So some of the other ways that termination era happened as well was something called Public Law 280. And Congress gave states the right to decide if they wanted criminal jurisdiction over states. And so some states chose this. Alaska, for example, is a Public Law 280 state. So if there is a major crime like rape or murder on Indigenous lands, or recognized Indigenous lands, normally federal law enforcement would be involved, but in a Public 280 state, it's state law enforcement that gets involved. And the thing with Public Law 280 is that the federal government doesn't give these states any money for policing or criminal investigations and such. So a lot of states, a lot of the sheriffs and things, they see it as a drain and a waste, and it creates an even more tense relationship between law enforcement and local government and Native tribes, while also taking away, excuse me, I've got a little bit of a raspy voice tonight, a little bit of a cough. I apologize. But it also, most importantly, it takes away tribes' rights to jurisdiction over our own lands. If I go to another country and I break a law, I don't get to say, oh, well, I'm not a citizen here, so your laws don't apply. But, that's how it works with Public Law 280, basically. Tribes don't get to decide what happens on their lands. So the other really important piece that made the state of Texas and the Brackeen family's argument even more galling about how ICWA shouldn't apply to children that don't live on reservations is that during the termination era, the federal government terminated the federal recognition of 109 tribes. And they did it primarily in Oregon and California, where they wanted land and resources. They terminated 62 tribes in Oregon. Today, there are only 9 federally recognized tribes remaining. In California, they terminated 44 tribes. There are 110 federally recognized tribes remaining today. And through this termination process, the government removed, and I have come across different numbers here, but the Native Land, Indian Land Tenure Foundation has on their site that over 1.3 million acres of land were removed from trust status during this period, with over 13,200 tribal members losing their affiliation. So we've had our lands taken from us in a number of ways. So then to argue that ICWA shouldn't apply if we're not on our lands is just absurd. It's like an extra, like they've dug the knife in and now they're twisting the knife. I don't know how else to explain what it was like to sit through that. So I'm almost done here with everything I wanted to touch on, but one of the things that was very frustrating that I noticed, and that the National Congress of American Indians president and the vice president, she's also the vice president of the Quinault Nation, Fawn Sharp, she said exactly what I had been thinking when there was a press conference outside the court after the hearing was over. Fawn Sharp was incredibly passionate. I mean, all the tribal leaders who spoke were incredible. But, Fawn really went into how upsetting it was to sit in that court and listen to, both the attorneys for Texas and Brackeen and all 9 of these justices asking questions and saying things that just make it so blatantly clear that they don't even understand who we are. They don't understand the difference between being a race and being a sovereign nation. They just have no clue. They have no clue at all. Even the justices that I'm like, I know you're gonna rule in favor of ICWA and tribes and everything. It was very upsetting. Kagan had actually asked the question, is the political community more important than the welfare of the child? And, the political community happens to be a tribal nation, and the welfare of the child is best when with our tribes. But it was sort of unbelievable to have to sit through that. And of course there were the justices who we know are not going to rule in our favor. Thomas, I feel like I barely even heard him ask any questions or speak during the case, but he's very anti-Native. He rules against anything related to Natives. Alito, Thomas, Roberts, Kavanaugh, they will all rule against it. Alito actually said, he actually tried to say in terms of the fact that people of federally recognized tribes that are different from that of the child in an ICWA case could foster this child. Alito actually tried to say, well, he didn't try to say, he did say, he said, before white people came here, you all were going to war with each other. Why should a child go to that of another tribe? It was just basically before we came along, you were all savages. It was just really, really offensive. He asked the question of one point, what if an Indian parent doesn't want a child treated like an Indian? I mean, I don't even understand what that question means. He also said at one point that Native children have no right in the decision of tribal membership. I mean, that's not entirely true, first of all. And second, it's like I said earlier, I was born in the US. I'm an American citizen. Like, I didn't have a choice in that. It just is what it is, I guess I could renounce my citizenship, but it's just so frustrating. And part of the reason it's like this is because law school students, they're taught nothing about Indian law. They know nothing about trust and treaties. You don't have to know anything about Indian law to pass the bar. You don't have to know anything about it to be a judge, to serve on the bench. And so many of our issues end up in federal courts. And I've sat through other cases where I've seen judges where I thought, like, I don't think you're trying to be so ignorant, but you are so ignorant that you don't even understand what's going on. You don't even understand the basics of who we are. So why do you get to make these massive decisions about us on our land, and I quickly want to point out is that some of the things I heard in this case, they tie to other Supreme Court cases, like the Dobbs ruling last year that overturned Roe v. Wade. In the leaked draft opinion that Alito wrote, he cited Amy Coney Barrett saying that there were not enough domestic children to adopt. She's got children of color that she's adopted. It kind of leads me to go, well, wait, are you trying to see Native children as being another part of that domestic supply? It's also just really important to point out that the states, like Texas, for example, who's involved in this case, all of the states involved are some of the worst ranked states for the well-being of pregnant, capable people and children. It's galling, really. There's also right now, the U.S. Supreme Court heard on October 31st 2 cases related to affirmative action. It was Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina, and the second one was Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard College. Those 2 cases challenge race-conscious admission programs at Harvard and University of North Carolina. Well, during the Haaland v. Brackeen case, one of Kavanaugh's questions was saying, is ICWA basically the same as affirmative action in school admissions and employment? I know they're all different cases, but I could just see how in their minds all of this tied together. And it just creates even more of a sense in my mind, a sense of urgency for solidarity across communities, especially for Native people. We are still suffering genocide. Between 2019 to 2022, our life expectancy went down 6.6 years. We can't do these fights on our own. Like, we should be leading our fights, but we need to be in solidarity with other communities. They need to be there for us and we need to be there for them. And so before I kick it back to Maha, I just want to say that, like, I'm really happy to be here and to be a part of this. And I'm very thankful and honored and humbled that you all have me here and are, taking part of your evening to be here and listen to me. So with that, I'm going to stop and mute myself.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was incredibly powerful and helpful in our understanding of this case and also just the broader context. You addressed some of the questions I had wanted to ask you, in terms of Kavanaugh's argument about affirmative action. But I'm also curious about the argument of reverse racism. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that interesting accusation.
Well, it's a little like how I talked about earlier, how the Brackeen family got upset that they couldn't just outright adopt this native child, that there were steps that were in place that they had to go through before they could, adopt this child. Um, and so they think that that's racism against them. It's absurd. You know, white people don't experience racism. Like, you all are guilty of racism, not you don't experience it. But that was very much the argument that Gibson Dunn made, was that ICWA is reverse racism. That, which also could lead to other issues, tearing apart tribal sovereignty. If you start saying, instead of tribes being political entities, being sovereign nations, that instead we're just races of people, then you can tear down so many pieces of policy that are in place for us, including funding. Like, unfortunately, because of what the colonizers done to us, we rely very heavily on the US government for grant money. Like, this just, my mind spins out in so many directions on how this case could harm us, as well as other BIPOC communities. Any community that's not just white should be concerned about this. Like, these cases, they cite other cases, like they're citing case law. All it takes is a judge ruling the wrong way, and that can do a great deal of harm to many communities.
Right. And then I know, you've talked about this before, but the idea that ICWA has really been the gold standard in terms of child welfare, and the way that, the conservatives and judges alike are really trying to dismantle this, although it has been recognized as such a powerful force and beyond even Native communities. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
I mean, it goes back to kind of like how I said, the people who are against ICWA don't even do anything around children's rights, family, and child welfare. They don't even have their hands in those pots, you
Right.
know. Um, so it really is just I don't know. It's mind blowing to me. Like it's just also mind blowing. I don't know. I apologize. I feel a little overwhelmed and I'm unsure of what to say
No,
right now.
no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I can't imagine how difficult this is. And, obviously there's a really long history of state violence and violence against Indigenous communities. And so, it's very interesting, right? How the discourse around this case, as well as just the way that the case is being argued, is really trying to minimize the erasure of Native communities,
Hmm.
and to find some way to, make it seem as though that's not the ultimate goal of these kind of challenges. And in a white supremacist country, obviously we know what the fundamental goal is, and we know what the end goal is. And so, what can we do? What can the rest of us do in terms of showing solidarity to Indigenous communities, both in terms of, narrative challenges, but also supporting some of the legal challenges as well?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, look at, where do you live? Whose lands do you live on? Who are the tribal nations there? And look and see what's going on there. What are the local tribes interested in? What are they fighting for? Maybe they're fighting for water rights. Maybe they're trying to get a casino built. All the tribes are different and all have different needs. Um, so that's the first thing I would say. But then in terms of ICWA, you know, you can contact your member of Congress, you can push on them, but unfortunately, Congress doesn't have any say in this right now. I mean, Congress is the only one constitutionally that has say over Native tribes, but the court is the one that's going to decide this. And I don't know. I'm not convinced we're going to win it. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskins of my tribe, he said in the press conference we will, but I don't know. The other thing I would say is that we have to think of solidarity, and we have to look at what's happened to Native people and what's still happening to us. A conversation that I had with Maha just yesterday, I think, was about under Trump, when there was the talk of the Muslim registry. It was like, yeah, that's horrible. It's truly awful. But we already have an ethnic registry in this country, and it's of Native people, and I'm on it. I have a special federal number just because I'm Native. So I think that's another piece where I'm like, solidarity is so important. Like, if you look at what's been done to us, it can help prepare you for what might be done to you and yours. Like, we should be working together, because ultimately, even though our communities are different, our issues are different, ultimately the person hurting me is also hurting you. So doesn't it make sense we come together in whatever way that means? I also want to encourage people to donate money. Native organizations, we get less than 1% of philanthropic dollars. We have no money. We don't have money. So donations are what, we survive or die off of, is whether or not we get those donations. So that's a huge one. Donate to us. And especially if you're in a position to make a regular monthly donation, please do so. Crushing colonialism always needs funds to support the work we're doing. The other thing I want to say is that maybe your local organizations need some volunteers of special skills. If you're a lawyer and know nonprofit law, maybe there's a Native organization that needs help like that. There's always a way for us to help out and support each other in one way or another. I always feel like those questions are so hard to answer, because I'm like, well, depends on the community, depends on the issue. And I could talk about that for hours, but that's kind of that's what I've got to say. I really want to encourage you all to read Native news. Read news about Native issues written by Native people. That's huge. Rebecca Nagel, who I mentioned earlier about the This Land podcast, actually put out a Twitter thread that has a list of all the Native journalists who have written on the ICWA case since the hearing. I really want to encourage you, go read those, go look at those, go follow and support all those journalists. Learn from us. Don't listen to the New York Times. They don't have any Native journalists. Read Native press. Yeah.
So I really appreciate, Jen, sort of the reflection on the historical legacy of state violence, and obviously the ongoing legacy of state violence, because as you know, right, Muslim Counter Publics Lab specifically focuses on the war on terror. And the ways that we're often taught about the violence of the United States is that, different people are being targeted in different ways. And that, especially with the war on terror, right, there was this idea that was ushering a whole new kind of violence, which of course there's particular kinds of violence that are weaponized against different communities. But fundamentally, right, the United States basically has learned to make its violence more effective. And obviously, that started with Indigenous communities. And so I just really appreciate that thread, and wondering about, what are some ways we can really connect the dots. I only honestly recently heard about the Haaland v. Brackeen case. And, I was surprised I hadn't heard more, but really drawing these connections and making people understand, right? If we are working in our case, right, for Muslim rights post 9/11, that necessarily means we have to understand, right, the legacy of the violence, and And because, it's not really justice, right? If it's just justice for one community.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, you and I have actually we've talked just very briefly about this in the past, but something I'm trying to have more conversations with Native people about is that we have those of us considered American Indian and Alaska Native, and I say that because those are not our terms, but that's how data is collected. We serve in the U.S. military at a higher rate per capita of any other ethnic or racial group. Frankly, I think a great deal of that is because of enforced poverty by the U.S. government, as well as manipulation. I've heard stories of military recruiters saying like, "Oh, you all are warriors and braves. This is your legacy. This is protecting your lands." But the upsetting part of that is that while I understand we all have to survive somehow, and sometimes that means making really bad choices, because if you only have bad choices, you can't make a good choice. But something that I find really upsetting about this that kind of relates back to that war on terror is that because we serve at such high rates, some of our people have taken on some really bigoted mindsets. I saw with my father and that generation and a little older who were in Vietnam and Korea, there was a lot of very anti-East Asian sentiment. And I see with my generation and the generation below who served in both Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, there is this tendency towards Islamophobia and just, a very anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern, regardless of religion, because let's be real, there are many religions being practiced in what we call the Middle East, and that's upsetting. I see that as, we're just we're being manipulated and used to turn around and do to others what's been done to us. And that's kind of also where I see our fights being tied together. I also have been called a terrorist. Um, and I, meanwhile, I've never done a violent act in my life, but I'm called that simply because I'm a Native who's standing up for the rights of my people and our land and our future generations. And, I feel like the US government, the UK, whatever the colonizer is, I feel like they create terrorists. They just start calling you that for no reason. And if you do stand up and fight, it's like, well, I'm defending myself. I'm not fighting. I'm just trying to stay alive. But yet they see that as terrorism, and then they do the things that they do. And yeah, I could ramble on some more, but I'll just stop there.
Oh, we have a lot of time. We have a lot to talk about on that. In that vein, because yes, terrorism has been extremely weaponized by the state, right?
Hmm.
And it's the way the state declares its own violence as more moral, actually
Hmm.
just moral, right, and morally superior. And
Yes,
anyone else who commits acts of violence is inherently a terrorist. So
exactly.
yeah, so that's a really interesting and powerful, right, point of intersection. So we have a couple of minutes. I don't think there's any questions for the audience from the audience yet. So I want to ask you, maybe Jen, one more question, which is, where do we go from here? I know that there are differing opinions as to whether or not this challenge will be successful. So can you just tell us or walk us through what you think um, we should do next, what should happen next, what are some next steps, depending on what ultimately is decided on by the Supreme Court?
I'll be honest, I don't have a real answer for that. I wish that I did, but I don't. Um, the only thing I feel like I can say right now is that regardless of what happens, whether tribes win or lose on this, we're still going to be fighting in the courts. We're always going to fight. I mean, we have no choice but to fight or we won't survive. And that in and of itself is its own trauma that is quite difficult to live with, but we'll fight. If we win this case, we'll celebrate, but we know we're still going to have so many other cases to fight. Like, it really feels sort of like some days the existence as a Native person is just fighting. I mean, there is joy. there are those good moments too, but it feels like it's just, we just got to fight. And I wish I had some wonderful answer of next steps and things that are concrete that people could just do and we'd fix the problem. But it's just so much more than call your member of Congress or, sign a petition. It's just so much bigger than that. Like, I think it's really going to come down to us all working together to dismantle the state, but also simultaneously building a new world together, because we can't just destroy the government that we have and in the world that we have if we don't have something else in place. And I think those are the things we need to really be thinking about and working on.
Absolutely. And, we'd obviously love to bring you back once the decision is made, just to figure out, and show our solidarity with Indigenous communities, including Indigenous Muslim communities. One thing that folks can do that is concrete, which we have mentioned a couple of times, is to donate to Indigenous organizations. Below on the screen, there's a ticker with a bit.ly link to donate to Crushing Colonialism. And if you've been watching this broadcast, you know how incredible Jen Deerinwater is, and how incredible Crushing Colonialism is, and how important. As a Muslim, I know the ways in which stories of Muslims are told in very problematic ways. It is a constant battle to push back against the demonizing and criminalizing narratives. And so it's really imperative and important that we support Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizers and activists and journalists who are trying to push back against mainstream media and share their own stories. So I really want to implore you again to donate to Crushing Colonialism. We will be sending out the video of this talk, and we'll encourage you once more to donate. And I can't say this enough, because Indigenous communities have faced so much violence, as Jen has talked about extensively, but have also cared for the land that we now occupy, right? And we often do these land acknowledgements. We do a lot of symbolic gestures to show our solidarity with Indigenous communities, but it is absolutely important now and at all times, right, that we provide concrete support for our Indigenous siblings. So, with that, I want to give you, Jen, the floor just to give any final thoughts and remarks. And again, one more time, please donate to Crushing Colonialism.
Yeah, I feel like I've kind of said everything for right now. Please support Native news, support Indigenous news, multimedia creators, films, Crushing Colonialism. We really work to promote and help Indigenous media creators, storytellers get their work out there, get representation. And so that also, we really believe in working across borders and lands and oceans and everything. So I also really love to hear from other Indigenous relatives in other lands. Like, that's really lovely. And it's always really nice to hear about, oh, there's this new Indigenous written book or this new film that was made, because there's so much great content out there that I know Indigenous people are making, but that I don't necessarily know about. So, please share those things. Please be in touch. It may take me or someone else a while to get back to you. We're small. We're mighty, but we're small. So we're a small team right now. But yeah, we always do try to reach out and get back in touch with people. And once again, I just want to say wado to, which is thank you to Maha and to Chris, who was behind the scenes for making this happen. And to all of you out there in the audience for being here with us this evening. Means a lot.
Thank you so much again, Jen, for your wisdom, for your brilliance, and willingness to be here with us again. And I know that sharing these stories and talking about the violence of this country is very taxing. So I really appreciate being here with you. And I'm excited to build with Crushing Colonialism and with you as well. And to really think about what does solidarity mean for Indigenous communities and how do we collectively push back against state violence in the future, but also in repairing and thinking about the past. So thank you all again. One more plug. We are really trying to make sure that Crushing Colonialism gets our support. So please, please, please consider donating. Even better, become a sustainer. We will send out the video either tomorrow or next week, and we'll ask you for donations again. So please help us out and give Crushing Colonialism a little bit of support here to support our Indigenous siblings. Thank you again, and please reach out if you have any questions. Take care and good night.